you so much for coming on the show. It's good to finally meet you because it's how we meet each other, through Zoom nowadays. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about?
Right. Well, my name is Greg Mcneil, and I've spent my career in product development. So product management, product engineering, systems engineering, execution, leadership. And it's always been across different industries. I think it's always been driven kind of my innate curiosity, right? Just interested in kind of the new and the different and how they work. And just the touch points that I've seen, I would say I've seen a lot about what works, and I've also seen what doesn't work as well. And I've built, I've built computers for Apple. I've built listening devices for the CIA, smartwatches for Samsung, smart clothing for Nike, and just I think there's other things that I've worked on that we have yet to see. And I'd say in the last 10 plus years, the focus has really been on the new and the different and more conceptual design. So I do a couple things to satisfy that. One, I have a consulting company that I run that focuses on early conceptual designs from a systems perspective. So this is hardware, software, app interface, wireless connectivity. So I do that, and then I also have a full-time job. I work for a large Fortune 500 company focused on product management, marketing. But I also find myself gravitating to kind of the new and different, even in my role as a product manager and a marketeer. Things that are different and things that are changing. The second part of your question was, what am I passionate about? And I'm really passionate about the things that have never been done before, right? I've sat with many, from a customer or just any kind of interaction I might have in a product development setting. And I've always found that it's not so much the ideas that might be new and different, but how do we take those ideas and do something with them? So I'm always very excited about when somebody's trying to do something different. And it's not always just products. It's even how we go about conceiving products. How do we interface with potential customers out in the marketplace to understand what might be needed, what might be we be missing in our present product line? So a lot of that is really new too. So I'm always excited about the new and the different, always excited to learn something new. So that's that's really my focus, my background, and my passion.
Focus on new, innovative things. That's one of the reasons why I moved to the Bay Area. But it's interesting what you mentioned that so product management is it's almost fairly new in the form that it is today, because even how many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, there was no such thing as like product management, unless you were talking about sort of physical products, right? But are you talking about physical products specifically, or are you talking about software or?
I tend to work with systems. So, I'm fine with software and hardware. My background has been in hardware development. And I would say in the last 10 years, software and hardware have become just completely interlinked. Right. And, one is made more valuable with the other. Obviously, there's some software examples where that's not necessarily the case, but I think hardware is always made more valuable with software, whether it's connectivity, it's data that's being broadcast, analyzed, and then something is being spit down to the device that it can then execute the next thing. So I think the two together is really my focus, and how they come together, and that includes firmware and underlying architecture of the hardware. But I agree with you. I think it has changed quite a bit.
Well, what would you say? I mean, what's your definition of it? Because if you ask me, everyone has a different definition of what product management is. I mean, does it run the spectrum from preconception to support, or is there a piece of it that's outside of that?
Yeah, I've always thought the product management discipline starts very, very early in the process, and it extends all the way to the end. And I used to think of it in kind of two visual ways. One was like a curve, right? So product managers, development is more like a Gaussian distribution, right? It's got a nice bell curve, right?
Yeah.
We start off small. The idea is just germinating. Then we think about it technically and how we're going to do it. We start pulling the team together, and then you have this big burst of resources to execute on the engineering side of that, where product management tends to, obviously everything starts from zero, but they tend to ramp very quickly. And then they slowly start to come down as they're kind of communicating that vision to the engineering team, and the engineering team is continuing to grow. And I've always kind of thought of product management in my mind between, depending on complexity of product, but in the space I've been with, the types of products I've done, product management is always kind of in an engineering to product management ratio of, maybe as low as 12 to 1, depending on
Hmm.
complexity and market, maybe all the way up to 25 to 30 to 1. So a
Hmm.
product manager to a group of engineers that are building a product. So that product management curve starts to drop down, certainly near the peak of the engineering kind of Gaussian bell-shaped curve.
Hmm.
And then the product manager starts to curve back up as engineering starts to drop off, because now they're that communication vehicle to the market, working with the go-to-market folks within their own team. They're working with the market itself and the acceptance of the product. And then depending on products are distributed, they're sold directly, they're sold through channels, all of those kinds of things, all the way out until we get to maybe the end of life of that product. And then how does it transition with another generation, or it's been replaced by something completely different. So
Right.
that's one way I think of the two. And then the other visual that always helps when I kind of communicate this this kind of dance between the two, because I think there always has to be healthy tension between product management and the engineering side.
Hmm.
And I think of product management as actually painting an image, and it's a watercolor image. So it's not really crisp, not super clear, but you have an idea that it's a landscape. It's a landscape with a few people in front of, a body of water, whatever it might be. So you have this kind of watercolor painting. And then as engineering starts to take on that exact same image, it's really fine pencil line drawing. I mean, every detail is crisp and clear, which is why you have a volume of people to create that detail
Hmm.
from maybe the one or two people that had created that original concept. So that's how I think about them, is this, kind of not as clear and concise, impressionistic, water painted image, if you will, to this really crisp line drawing, which is really the recipe for the product that we're going to build.
Right. And is Agile in the entire process, or is it just basically mostly in the development process?
Well, it's interesting because I think traditionally, when I started earlier in my career, product management was this really well-defined, PRDs was the ultimate document that they would release. And, I've
Yeah.
done presentations on product management, the discipline itself. And one of the slides I used to present was, the 3 letters PRD on a huge slide with a big red circle and a slash.
I remember those days.
Yeah, and just trying to communicate to people, not that the PRD is not the right thing to do, or it's dead, or it's just it's when you're focused on the new and the different. To me, it feels like a experienced entity that's understanding the market and digesting market research and analyzing all the data they have about the technology and how people might use it, and then creating this PRD that then gets kind of handed to engineering, that then starts to figure out how to do that line drawing that has the detail. I think that we don't have good vehicles for the iteration, right?
Hmm.
There needs to be a more iterative process. So that's always what I've been promoting, certainly through the consulting that I do with Kurio Labs, is let's figure out what we think we need really quickly, and let's figure out how to build it really fast. And it might look a little ugly at first. It might have some wires hanging off the side of it, but if that's not really critical for how people are going to interact with it, then let it go. Let it
Hmm.
be okay, and then start to get that feedback, and then realize, oh my gosh, we totally thought the market wanted this, when in reality they kind of wanted something slightly different. So we get to learn, and that's where that iterative process comes in, which is the fail fast and design thinking, and some of these kind of terms that became certainly more mainstream 10, 15 years ago, at least, from when I started to hear about them and started to implement them and try them differently. So that's kind of how I think about that
Because
transition and how we hand off.
it seems like we've evolved. The science of it, I guess, has evolved into more of a almost like an internal entrepreneur, right? You start from you run the whole thing from beginning to end with teams doing parts of it, but the product manager is really involved in the entire process, and the product lives or dies based on the product management manager shepherding it through the process.
Yeah, and I think they really represent that. One key thing is the champion.
Mm.
It doesn't have to come from the product manager, but I think any any worthwhile effort that a team is trying to undertake requires champions. The champion's torch may transition depending on where we are in the state or phase of that whole team effort. But the champion is critical. And I think oftentimes the product manager becomes the champion. And a lot of engineers that default to the champion role tend to gravitate to product management roles
Right.
Over time. And so I think that's a kind of a key piece, that they definitely can be the one that holds the torch. But so long as somebody is holding the torch and is preparing to hand off as maybe their expertise or their experience starts to not maybe play as big a role. But I think the product manager definitely plays that champion, torch carrying role as well.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is sort of like a combination of skills, right? I mean, it's not, you can't just be technical, and you can't be sales focused, and you can't be too customer focused, and it's really a broad range of skills that you need to have to be good in that space.
Yeah, I kind of go back to this role that I originally saw when I worked for Apple. I went in as a manufacturing engineer, and then very quickly fell in love with product and product development and wanted to find a role in that world. And I came across a role that was called an engineering generalist. That was the title. And some people might think like,
that is really vague.
That sounds really vague. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the more vague, the better, because that's just the more things you're going to learn, because it's just a broad, and it was a very broad role. And really it was just another term for a program manager.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that going into it, but it was a fantastic role. And I just got exposed to so much. And I think that as you're, highlighting, I think that's a really important skill set for the product managers, to have that really broad role. But also too, if I don't know, what's around that corner, I've got to be curious. I've got to peer around that corner and say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. And how does that connect back into what we're trying to do? Because inevitably, to me, engineering is just and I've explained this, kind of to my teams many times, is, look, we're just paid decision makers.
Yeah, exactly.
How fast you make the decisions, how little information you can make good decisions with, and then how do your decisions affect others around you, because they're making decisions too. And so these decisions kind of have to think. And so I think product managers are kind of overseers of those decisions. And they're also once again, the champion, right? Because I'm trying to educate everybody as we go, because oftentimes when you're on these teams, I've got specialists, and the specialist in one function doesn't really fully understand what the specialist in another function is doing. And so product managers and program managers, really, good, solid technical programming, they're really good at kind of educating the whole team on how it is to be in somebody else's shoes. So you have a little bit healthier respect about timelines and deadlines and how handoffs happen and roles and responsibility and all those other kinds of things. So,
right. Well, what if you're, a lot of times we have issues sort of shepherding these products through an organization. Like how do we get sort of innovative new products through the barriers that we might come up against? I'm sure you've had that situations where here's a really cool new thing that you want to do, but there's a lot of pushback and a reluctance to move it forward. I mean, how do you work on something like that? How do you help push those things through?
I think there's probably two phases to that, right? So when I was running the innovation labs at Flex, also previously known as Flextronics, we were really focused on, if a customer had a specification, we had design teams all over the world that specification, and your request could go to them. It's when you didn't have a specification and you had ideas, you came to the group that I was building.
Right.
And so we really define that as just, we have to be a lot more comfortable with ambiguity, because we're used to getting specs. We all came from product development, product management disciplines. And so we were used to getting specs. And now, we're getting ideas, and we're getting some ideas that are like, wait a second, that's crazy. You can't physically do that, but it gives you insight into what they're thinking, right? That the particular, in this case, customers coming to us and sharing their ideas, so we could help them with technology and implementation and building. But I think that the first step is making sure your development team, and that's not always just engineers, right? We've got lots of people that are involved in development, product development, creation, but getting them comfortable with ambiguity. And I think that's a really important part, that once they're comfortable with ambiguity, when we get to the point where we're peering over the edge and we can't quite get far enough over to see what we see, And we have to just use our experience and our own teamwork and basically make our best guess about what's going to be over that edge. And so we're prepared. So I always used to paint this picture for engineering just to help them product development. As I always told them, I said, look, we know where we want to go, right? Our goal is the mountaintop across this valley, and we can see the mountaintop. It's clear as can be. It's a beautiful day on that mountaintop, but it's a long way away. And between us and that mountain is a valley, and that valley is just shrouded in fog. And we have no idea what we're going to experience on our path to that mountaintop. And so ambiguity and comfort with it is important because you're really walking into the unknown. But I think that, building tools for how do we take what we've known in the past? How do we take our history? How do we take all that and not let it, force us down a path that maybe isn't the best path based on what's facing us right now? So, we practice that. We often would hold, brainstorming sessions where we could actually just practice sharing ideas. We did all sorts of workshops on improv, if you will, right? Engineers trying to do improv with each other. But it just, well, it was because
that must have been fun.
That came out of that were quite interesting. But it just forced us to use kind of some parts of our brains that maybe we weren't as comfortable with. And I think that was maybe the first part of your development team has to be comfortable with ambiguity when you're focused on the new and the different and the conceptual turning into, minimum viable products growing to prototypes that are growing to final products. I think the second part of it that I've learned is not only does your development organization have to kind of be comfortable with it, but you have to get everybody else around it that's supporting it in some way, whether it's you're doing this for a customer, or there's an end market you have in mind, or there's an entire ecosystem you're trying to stimulate and show them that, hey, there's a different way. And if we did this, we could leverage that and this together. And now we have something much bigger than those parts. So I think that for me, my experience has always been, right, when I said early on, right, systems, I'm always been about systems, is you got to build something and put it in their hands. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be relevant to your audience, right? If you're trying to pitch somebody on a new product concept, and this is the first time they're going to really kind of viscerally feel it, you can't give them something that's, made out of cardboard and it's got stuff hanging off of it and it looks awful and doesn't fit well in your hand.
So much for the design thinking argument, right?
Well, there's a time and place for that. But once again, I was saying your audience, right? Because if I'm trying to communicate an idea to somebody who's really been thinking about this for a long time, but they don't know how to develop it or they don't know how to create, well, then fine, cardboard's going to work great for them. But when I'm trying to maybe go to somebody who's going to ultimately say, we're going to invest in this or not, I think that initial impression is really important. So I think it's critical to be able to show people, and showing can be something you can mock up in software. It can be something you can even do on a whiteboard, depending on your audience. But if you're actually trying to go out there and win somebody over and really convince them that there's opportunity here, make it as high fidelity as you can, as quickly as you can. And you have to make those trade-offs, because it's fine to tell somebody too, like, we've completely ignored this half of it because we know how to do that. We know we can do that, but we wanted to get this in your hands. So basically look at it from the right, don't look at it from the left, or something like that, right? So I think that's the second part of it, right? Is building a product organization that's comfortable with ambiguity, and then quickly being able to figure out how you can turn ideas into something that people can actually experience. And that experience is different depending on who they are and where they're coming from.
To help move these things forward, or can you do it without?
It depends what you're doing. I think if it's really far out there, it's really something that people are going to have a real struggle embracing. I think having that champion out there is going to help. I don't think it's always obvious when you start, because there is so much ambiguity, what characteristics you need in that champion. But ultimately, I do believe you're going to need champions at all levels.
Right.
And how do you determine that, and how do you gain them? That becomes the real challenge. And I think probably for me, it's a harder question to answer, because I've always kind of innately been the champion.
Yeah.
I'm just always so excited about something new.
You just end up taking over in that role.
Yeah, it becomes like, it's just intuitive to be passionate and excited and show energy about it. And I've
Yep.
always gotten that kind of feedback, because I always have tons of energy. But I think it is really important. And I would say in past experiences where I haven't spent enough time, especially with, kind of executive level oversight that ultimately is funding some of these things. I've certainly learned lessons in my career that, yeah, we could have done a better job at that. And maybe that would have changed the course of how this went, or maybe it would have, ended it sooner, or it would have extended it longer. So I think it is important. And whether or not you think you have them, it's really important to figure out, who they are, because you can use them to help kind of build that momentum and maintain that momentum, depending on what you're ultimately trying to do. And it's hard to, kind of generalize on, one system that works for no matter what it is. It just depends. I mean, it depends on your team. It depends on the market. It depends on, the technologies that you're embracing. Depends on the disruption that you're maybe ultimately trying to overcome. It depends on the strength of an ecosystem. I've done products that are trying to, have an impact on an ecosystem. And the ecosystem, when I say that, it's just many, many things that contribute to the experience that a customer might have. And so you're being able to influence a product that solves a particular problem and people are really excited about it is a different problem than a product that contributes to a group of services and solutions and products and behaviors that are then part of a bigger ecosystem. They're different kinds of things. And it's important to kind of know what you're getting into when you start, because how you embrace it, how you contribute to it might be different.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like the ROI of innovation, right? Because a lot of times you're pushing forward and you're coming up with these concepts which they got a fuzzy connection to ROI, right? You can't say, this particular feature is going to bring in X amount of money, so you can't really even do a business case for it. But there's tons of great ideas out there. Do you have any tactics or strategies on how you can convince people to look at those ideas and do something with them? Because I'm sure you must have had some ideas in the queue that are like, that's great, but I don't see how we can charge for it.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of get people over that hump. I've experienced this a lot in the industrial space, right? So these are industrial products that show up in, factories and, manufacturing environments and testing environments. And, people think big, heavy machinery. It doesn't always have to be big, heavy machinery, but machinery is kind of a good way to think about it. And a lot of companies in the industrial space that specialize in industrial products have been reaching out and trying to, how do I, make my products smarter? How do I, create more data? And then, kind of what do I do with it? And that's been challenging. And I talked to others that have, focused specifically on the industrial space. And I think we commonly, come back to this point, like, we built this high fidelity model very quickly. We communicated what the vision was, and now it's, kind of the blocking and tackling and really kind of thinking things through and how the business model is going to change. And these weren't just, we're going to cannibalize the existing business model and we're going to uproot it and have something completely new. No, these were, secondary and tertiary kind of connections to existing business models, and they could take time to develop. So they were fairly safe. But I can remember doing a innovative product many years ago where we were trying to integrate technology. When I say technology, I really mean, kind of electronics and PCBs into textile-based products. And this happened to be in a woman's handbag that we were integrating technology. And we got all the way to, production level. This isn't a super complicated product or anything, but and when the company finally digested the product, they realized that they have no way to get this product to their customers, because this was a women's fashion brand. They did, dresses and accessories and handbags and a little bit of jewelry. But to start to think about technology and technology products and when they don't work, and how do you support your customers that are used to coming in to buying, material-based products that are, really nice looking and they feel really good against your skin. And all of a sudden now the thing won't turn on.
Yeah.
How do I deal with that? So
exactly. It's a completely foreign thing to some of these companies.
It's a different problem. And we used to joke that on their manufacturing line, because this particular handbag we were making was a leather handbag being manufactured somewhere outside the US, I can't remember exactly where, But we used to kind of joke, like, are they even going to have, electrical outlets on the manufacturing line? Or is it people literally
Yeah.
hand sewing these at a table? Because
Yeah.
we have to then test it when it's done, or does it have to go to another facility? And it's just a different kind of world because we don't worry about having plenty of outlets in a traditional technology manufacturing facility that we can do
Exactly.
these things. So that is the hard part that I've found many times over. And I've even found it where, right, let's just say you're going down a path and you're trying to create something new that it started from ideas, and you're really building that prototype proof of concept. Generally, you're looking across the market and you're saying, look, this is the product type that we're going to compete with. It's not always something just totally brand new. It's the margarine and the butter kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
Um,
because it's very
and
difficult to introduce something completely brand new, because I mean, you've got to educate people. And how do you convince people to create something and sell something completely brand new? I mean, sometimes it's just a fluke that
yeah,
it actually
yeah,
works out. But go on.
it is. And so I would find that often we would cross off, like, hey, we can beat it on that point. We can beat it on this point, but yeah, this point we're still not as good.
Hmm.
So maybe we're less expensive, we're faster, and we're brighter, but we're louder and we're heavier. Just throwing out some variables, right? And so you can automatically in your mind kind of think about, like, okay, well, I could see where that could be replacing, depending on how customers weight those particular variables.
Right.
I did a project at an industrial company, and every single checkbox, no matter what you compared it to, was better. In every category, it was cheaper, it was lighter, it was better, it had higher fidelity, it had more data, I mean, everything about it. And this particular company they just couldn't quite figure out how to turn that into something, because all of a sudden they went from selling a box, if you will, to selling an intelligent box that they could literally, to potentially giving away the same box and selling services that they could actually extract more revenue over time from the box they used to previously sell. So that was the level of business model change that they were having to think about. And I think we see more and more of that, but it was really difficult. Not that any one person in the company couldn't understand what you were saying, but it was changing their own systems and their own philosophy and their own business models and how they measure themselves and how do they change. And those become the more intangible things that are more and more difficult to try and communicate. So I think it's important that you're taking the baby steps, which is why if we sit down and we conceive of the most amazing product and has all the great integrated technology, and then we spend another year plus developing it, you got to kind of lead folks along with the little baby steps, which is why the conceptualizing and the MVPs and the prototypes and the proof of concepts and all these things kind of help, because one, it signals too that, look, we don't know everything. You're closer to the customer, you're closer to the business than maybe we are, especially if I'm a third party coming in to help you, or even if we're part of the same company, where my background is more on the market and the engineering, and you're more on how do we run this business long term, or how does it affect our other businesses. You want to bring those people along, because they're going to kind of collectively chip away at the ideas that only make it better and better and better. Which also, in addition to kind of being comfortable with ambiguity, you have to have a relatively thick skin, because you're like, this is the greatest idea ever. And then somebody points something at it and you're like, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good point. Right. So I
Yeah.
think that it's the little kind of incremental wins, and kind of spoon feeding people along the way, and being prepared to kind of shift as new things come up, or as it fits better into an existing business model that allows them to integrate it over time, as opposed to taking maybe a lot of risk. And it's just different industries assume a different amount of risk for the new and the different. Industries that are more highly regulated, that has a whole different culture around product development. Medical devices, automotive products, as opposed to a consumer electronic device, they're very different, some of the cultures and expectations around them. So all those kind of have to be fed into the machinery as you're kind of working through to answer your question. How do you get people to kind of buy into it?
Yeah.
I think it's a small bite at a time, honestly.
Well, it's kind of like, speaking of bites, it's kind of like the way I think of Apple. Like, everyone keeps talking about how Apple is the most innovative company in the world, right? And personally, I don't think they are. I mean, they're excellent at execution, and if they really were innovative, they'd have a Google Glass or an augmented reality goggles or something. They'd be pushing MVPs out all the time, and it would be on the cutting edge of things. But that's not how they operate. They operate in the laggard. They operate in the sort of super public, super popular, the technology for everyone. So that's why they don't just throw stuff out there like Google does and expect people to play with it. They do it in a very measured way. It's a very measured approach. That's why when you pick up one of their devices, it's already been thought through really well. And if you ask me, that's doesn't feel innovative to me. It feels like it's excellent execution, but it's not particularly innovative. But that's fine, because sort of your regular person on the street probably doesn't want anything that's too cutting edge or too innovative or too out there, right?
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I've worked with companies in the past that have, innovation or very innovative in kind of their moniker, what they're known for in their particular markets. Whether it's consumer electronics, whether it's the sporting good industry, whether it's even in automobiles. And I think what's interesting is, on the whole, I would agree with you that the time I spent at Apple, I learned product development, I guess the Apple way, because it was early in my career. And I still interact with companies now that they don't have what Apple had 20 plus years ago in how
Yeah.
they implemented and how they executed. And I think many things are different, and it's much harder to do development inside Apple now than when I was there, because everything is so secretive. And I do some work with them. I have many colleagues that work there, and we share stories, but it's hard because they have the secretive element to it. But I think there's also companies like that, and others that I've experienced, where there's pockets of innovation that happen. So I think that where we see some of the things that seem like they're kind of obvious, but probably are much harder than we thought they would be when we see them and start using them. And I think Apple's really good at that. They're really good at making it seem like this has been easy. And so I imagine there's many pockets inside where some of these ideas can kind of germinate. And there's Google's done this with the 1 day per week where you can kind of explore different ideas. And I think different companies treat it differently about how they at least hold it dear. So that's probably something that leads to some of the advances that we see, because I found that from an innovation perspective, especially when I was really focused on it in the labs at Flextronics, working with a lot of different customers, because they're all coming in. So we had this massive pipeline of ideas that we found that oftentimes innovation is just taking things that exist and repackaging them in different ways that are unexpected and unusual, that all of a sudden serve a slightly different purpose, or they've gotten rid of friction in the system that everybody struggled with but couldn't articulate. So it wasn't clear to say, oh, if you could just make it do this better, then I would be so much happier. It's not as easy as that. And so I found that when we were really, really focused and condensed and doing it over and over with very different types of ideas in different markets, that it really became how do you fit things that are fairly common together in new and different and unusual ways that have outcomes that you never would have imagined. And I think, like I said earlier, getting people comfortable with that. And I imagine that some of the other companies I mentioned, Apple that you mentioned, there's pockets inside where these kinds of things flourish. And those then trickle out to the more mainstream kind of things that then show up in products, or they've now tweaked something that's happened. I don't know how Apple communicates across the silence boundaries, right? Because certain teams don't know what other teams are doing, because there's a certain kind of secretiveness to what they do, which is also part of the marketing mystique. But I imagine there's pockets of these kinds of pools of resources where these ideas can flourish, and then they kind of bounce back into the mainstream. And that's how I would imagine it would happen. And I think that's healthy for any company. And I often see that companies trying to have these innovation centers or an innovation lab so ideas can find a place to flourish. The challenge they generally have is, how do they get accepted back into the system? I saw a job description not too long ago, and it was for a innovation leadership in some capacity. I don't remember exactly how it was worded or whatever, but it was talking about all the things that we respect about innovation, trying and failing and learning and failing fast and all these other things. But it had actually
Written by HR, no doubt.
and it had written in the job description that a 50% failure rate. So every other thing you did had to be successful. So
Wow,
one thing you
that
learned
is
from,
high.
one thing you failed from. I mean, it just, and I thought, wow, that's somebody who doesn't really understand how this
Yeah.
works, because if your expectation is that every other thing that I do is going to be a rocket ship to the moon, that's not how the exploratory side works.
Yeah.
And so therefore it needs different metrics. We need different metrics and different ways to track it, which are themselves, at least the ones that I've found and implemented over time, they tend to be, not as crisp as an ROI or a PO with a dollar amount on it,
Yeah,
or a
exactly.
schedule with a date. I mean, those are all very crisp and clear. So I think that's comfortable with ambiguity. The team can be comfortable, but whoever that team is ultimately reporting up to also has to be comfortable. And so there are metrics you can use and you can track. And I think that, along the lines of, KPIs that really make sense for the type of work you're doing is that thick skin comment I made earlier. I mean, if you're failing more than half the time, and that's kind of really what's expected. But remember, you're failing fast. So you're not spending a lot of time and dollars to figure things out. And every time you fail, it's really a lesson. That's what I used to like to think. It's, what did we learn? What did we learn? And then that can be applied to the next thing. But I think that that's really important, because you have to be pretty confident to often be learning, as opposed to having POs come flying across the desk. It's a different kind of mindset.
Yeah, and you have to be the business has to be open to that. They have to be okay with it, right? I mean, 50% seems so high. I mean, it would probably be like 1% success rate, if you ask me. I mean, to really test everything out, right?
Yes. Oh yeah, it'd be much lower. That, and once again, how far out am I reaching, right? I mean, am I working on the next generation of product that we're shipping today? Yeah, your failure rate should be relatively high, because those are expensive endeavors. If I'm on the generation 2 after that, or if I'm just developing technology that ultimately is going to find its way into something, and I just wrap a product around it so people can kind of digest it and experience it, they're all kind of slightly different entities. But I think so long as you have that discussion early on and people are all aware, then the expectations can be more clearly set. So people aren't like, well, wait a second, this is like the third time you've tried this. And, well, when are we going to get something for it? And I'd often had that, at Flex. And one of the metrics that we came up with, which was, what do we influence? How much business do we influence? And so you'd ask the salespeople, if it weren't for what we're doing and you being able to bring your customers and have the experience that we have with them, whether we take their ideas and help them in an innovation workshop, turn them into something meaningful, whether we actually built them some prototypes so they could decide, like, wow, we're really not ready to do that product yet. And there may be some energy that exchanges for that. But now all of a sudden that customer looks at the entire company and says, wow, this is somebody I want to partner with more. I want it at a higher scale. So you'd ask the salespeople, like, how much business did we influence by our interactions with your customers? And you get some numbers back, and all of a sudden you add that up over time, and it's like, we're influencing $500 million worth of business.
Yeah.
And this is just a small little group that is also doing other things as well. So that became a really big measure for us. But, once again, it's, can somebody really measure how much business you're influencing? No, but if you poll enough people and you kind of add that up and put some safety factors around it, you get something that's reasonable.
Right. Do you think some of this has to do with sort of like bringing a new product to life has to do with the difference between sort of simplicity and complexity? Because the idea seems very simple, right? It's just like, here's an idea that we've come up with. We brainstormed it. This is the concept, and you can see the possibilities. But then actually trying to turn it into something that's implementable, that's when sort of there's tons of complexity underneath there that people don't really think about. Is that the case sometimes?
I definitely think that's the case. I used to use analogy again. I like to kind of talk in pictures, but I would tell the teams that when we would start something, and we've done the brainstorming, and we've got ideas, and we've got multiple things, and we've kind of boiled it down, and we've got some market input, and we, some technology input. And I would tell them, I said, look, there's tons of variables sitting on the table in front of us right now. Imagine them as little pieces of paper, as widgets, whatever you want to imagine them. They're variables. We don't know how they're going to be ultimately specified. That's what I mean by a variable. We don't know if it's going to be 5 or 10. I don't know. And So what I would tell them is I'd say, first thing we do is all the variables that we understand well enough, we know how we're going to do it. We just don't know exactly, get all those off the table. So really start to boil down to the things that are super meaningful. And then what you're left with is you're left with some variables that are really hard to kind of, maybe understand. They're variables that are going to be difficult to connect together. But now if I can build my proof of concept or my prototype or my MVP around those few variables that are left. Remember earlier when I said, oh yeah, just look at it from the right side, not the left side.
Yeah.
Let the wires dangle out. Go and find something that exists that has 80% of what you're trying to show and tear it apart, use pieces from it. And then now when you're able to take that out and let somebody interact with it, and it could just be a colleague. It doesn't have to be somebody that you don't know. It doesn't have to be a customer. It could just be somebody that gives you some feedback. And then very quickly, you realize the importance of those variables. And many times it's like, we thought it was going to be way more important than it was, but it's really not that important. So now that one can come off, but we got to bring these other couple on. But those ones we understand better. So now the problem just feels like it's a little bit better understood. Because I think when you're dealing with the unknown and ambiguity and ultimately how it's all going to come together, right? How are we going to get through that fog shrouded valley? You've got to limit how much stimulus, right? You can imagine you're down in that valley and now it's dark.
Yeah.
And then you start hearing things and you're stepping in things that are squishy and uncomfortable and it's cold and warm at the same time. And you're just like ready to explode.
You should be a writer, man. I love your analogies.
You're like overstimulated. And that's just a simple way of saying there's too many variables on the table. Let's get off the ones we know. And if we can't, then maybe we break it into two tables. And one team takes one and another team takes another, and then they come back together at some point and we start to connect the pieces that we know. And that's why I said earlier that a lot of times it's just taking what we know and just putting it together in ways that just people haven't done before. Because, if you're going to invent technology, right? I mean, you're going to invent some new rocket fuel. That's a different endeavor. It still can have the innovative side to it, can have the conceptual side to it, but it's just a very different big problem as opposed to a better way to, communicate something in the types of products that we already do. And I see a lot of that in, like I said earlier, the industrial space, the automotive space, the fitness kind of wearable space. That's a lot of places I've spent my time. I guess IoT falls into all those categories, but it's that general big category that,
right.
Compute, sensors, and connectivity. That's really what IoT is to me. But that's relatively new. Not a lot of products had compute, connectivity, and some sort of data gathering or spitting, data spitting, meaning it's sending data, capability. 10, 15 years ago, not a lot of products do, but now pretty much everything has the capability. Just how do we turn it into something useful? How do we monetize it? How do we build different business models around it? That's the unique
that's the
and
thing.
fun stuff.
Everything collects. A lot of things spit. It's like, what do you do with it all, right? I think we're at the point right now where we're collecting as much as we possibly can, assuming that at some point in the future we may be able to use it.
Yeah.
Right. Because I remember I was working with a bank and they were trying to figure out some quantum stuff. And it was kind of like, well, what if somebody's collecting all this data right now? They're collecting all these transactions that have been encrypted. And at some point in the future, they may be able to figure out how to decrypt them using quantum computing. So that's why we need to figure out quantum computing, because sometime in the future, someone who's collecting them today may be able to encrypt them. And it's like, I can't even think that far out, but I guess it is possible.
Yeah. And I mean, it's an interesting thought. I mean, and I think that, part of our discussion was around kind of the future of, where does all this kind of go? And I don't know if you're ready to jump there next.
Oh, yeah. Let's go.
I was going to connect something to what
are you going to mention
saying.
AI? Are you going to mention ChatGPT? Because now's the time.
Those are certainly things they're fun to experiment with. I tell you that.
Yeah.
But I think that ultimately where things go and the way that you win is, as you were saying, right? Everybody's collecting data. Everybody's just collecting data. We might find that most of that data is useless. But we aren't quite sure yet what data might be useless and what not. So it makes sense to collect as much as you can. And I think that ultimately where you go, if you look at like optimization and how you get more and more optimized, is the one that infers the most is the one that ultimately wins, right? Because today we might have a product that has, 3 different sensors, that then take that data and then they spit out two outcomes, you know, not an A or a B, but two different pieces of data that come from the three data inputs. Well, if I have to build that device and build the software for it, then it seems like if I built exactly the same thing, but I only had two sensors, but I could still generate the same two outputs from two sensors, not three sensors, then that's what I mean by inference. So this device is inferring what that third piece of data looks like. And ultimately, if I can bring that solution to market, then that should be less expensive than the one that needs three sensors. And so that inference is really where it gets important. And, you know, so AI is certainly playing in that world. That's kind of slightly what it's doing, but a more mechanized approach. And then I just, you know, more recently started thinking about, you know, we have lots of data stored in the cloud, right? There's lots of cloud service providers that are storing all this for us, but that data doesn't cross-pollinate. If there was a way to cross-pollinate that data, now you can have a hybrid cloud solution that I've got data stored on Google Cloud and I've got it stored on AWS, but connecting that data through those two entities, which of course, since the data is mine, you can't do that, but I can do that. But can I do that with another third party? Can I do that with a partner company? So starting to connect those data streams and make more useful inferences out of them I think is going to be a really powerful thing. Now, when I spoke earlier about ecosystems, that's a really big looking ecosystem. When you're thinking about all of the people that are contributing to that data, companies that are contributing to that data, the cloud service providers that are allowing us to hold it and then analyze it and do all sorts of wonderful things with it, as well as data that's sitting on-prem and data that's in devices that maybe has no way to get out yet, that ultimately will have a way to get out, and you start putting all that data together, then I think it becomes the, you know, kind of the race to who can infer the most accurately. Because we often have devices that are, you know, strapped on our wrist or whatever that are telling us that, you know, we're stressed or we need to rest. Or I have a bike computer and I finish, you know, a long ride. I've been riding my bike for a long time, raced for many, many years. And I'll go finish a ride. I haven't raced for 30 plus years, but I'll go finish a ride and they'll tell me that your recovery is, I think the most I've seen is 3.5 days.
Whoa.
It's recommending that
is that like a 40-mile ride or something like that?
It might be a little bit more than that, and you know, some intensity in there, but still, it's like, well, wait a second, I'm not going to not ride my bike. So it doesn't make any sense because it's giving me that, but it's trying to just generalize. But generalizing with me that rode 40, who's ridden a couple 100,000 miles in my life, versus somebody that maybe is just starting to ride 40, which is fantastic, but it can't be just one size fits all. So I think that's an important part of thinking about how, you know, products of the future. When I kind of say products, you know, my background is really in IoT, if you will, you know, things that have compute, things that have sensors, things that connect wirelessly so we can broadcast and compare, and, you know, data goes both ways. So
I think the thing is the technology's there, the data's there, it's all out there. We just need the people to agree to share it and figure out some way of sort of pulling it all together. Because I think what I like to say is that everything's going to happen. The only question is when. So I think we also have the technology. We have the technology and we have the data. We just need to, you know, get people to say, let me try this, right? Let's give this a shot. Because you're right. I mean, there's so many things around us that know so much about us, but they're not really doing anything. They're not proactively doing anything. I mean, I have to tell Alexa, do this, do this, do this. It's rare that it actually tells me something without me prodding it, right? I mean, they're starting to move in that direction now, but our systems, all of our systems around us, all the data that's being captured, they should be able to make these inferences and make suggestions, but it's just not doing it yet. And I think we're just, I mean, we might be afraid to step over that precipice or something like that, because like you said, it's foggy in there. We don't know what's going to happen.
And I think it's hard. I think it's just hard. It's kind of like, you know, autonomous vehicles and autonomous driving. I was just having this conversation at breakfast this morning with an old boss of mine who's an investor, and we were talking about autonomous flight, especially helicopter flight. Which helicopters are hard to fly, which is why we have helicopter pilots, and you and I just don't jump in helicopters and fly them. But to me, autonomously flying a helicopter seems a lot easier than autonomously flying or driving a car, because the environment that it's in. Now, unfortunately, the the risk of having something go wrong when you're in a helicopter is far worse than if you're in a car that can come to a slow itself down and pull over to the side. Or so that becomes, a kind of a risk reward trade-off. But I think it is definitely interesting, and it's interesting to kind of think where ultimately all this goes. But that's kind of how I boil it down, is if I can infer more data from fewer things than you need, then that is going to be an advantage, right? If we think about from an optimization perspective. But it's, as you said, time will tell.
Well, I think we should have flying cars. I think we were way past the time when we should have flying cars. And you're right. I mean, is it true that it's, you're talking about safety earlier, but it is easier to have a flying car or an autonomous helicopter or autonomous airplane because of the fact that there's not that much out there for it to run into. Isn't that the case? Or are there other forces that I can't even think of that would be affecting this thing?
Well, I think this is one of the challenges that we tend to do, is we tend to think into the future with the environment as we understand it, right? But if we think into the future, and if autonomous flight became something that was more mainstream, I mean, if you're in downtown New York City or Las Vegas and you're seeing the touring helicopters that are flying around showing tourists the town, or ferrying people, probably more ferrying in New York City.
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden, I don't know, 3-4 orders of magnitude of actual vehicles. Now that becomes a bigger problem. You do have elevation to your advantage, but it becomes a different kind of problem to solve. And does it become less and less efficient if I have to go 3 blocks and I leave from one high rise to another, but I have to go up, 5,000 feet in order to be safe to do it? Well, all of a sudden now, that's not going to be very, efficient to have to put out that much energy to move a body or a package or something from this point to that point, if just to be safe, because I want to have all these different things at different elevations. So, big challenging problems for sure.
Yeah. So you're right. I completely forgot the fact that we have to think about where we're going to be, where we have hundreds or even thousands of these things flying through the air. It becomes even more difficult. But when you see these sort of displays that people can do with programmed drones, you're like, oh, it's obviously going to be possible if we just upscale the whole damn thing a lot higher.
Yes. And, I mean, just, the energy consumption too, right? If 2 people are having to fly somewhere as opposed to rolling on wheels.
Yeah, that's true.
Because that sustainability is important. I mean, we have to think about those things because, they consume a lot of energy. And we learn that the hard way. It's some of the ideas. A lot of the things with IoT, certainly in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, battery usage and low power has gotten a lot more critical on the smaller little kind of devices. And how we think about that, and how we think about sustainability, and how we think about charging batteries, wireless charging, not very efficient. So that means a lot of energy is just being wasted as heat.
Yeah.
And is that a good thing? When 100 million people are doing it, maybe it's not such a problem, but when 8 billion people are doing it, it becomes a much bigger problem. So,
yeah. Well, I always thought that one of the issues we have too is that we just seem to sort of fall into a groove instead of just looking at first principles of what we're trying to do. So for example, if you're trying to get a person of 250 pounds or so from point A to point B, there's a lot more effective ways of doing it than putting them in a 2-ton SUV, right? So how do we get to that sort of minimum viable required vehicle to move this person from point A to point B, and then at the same time allow the use cases of, they want to travel with their family, or they want to travel with their dogs, or they want to travel with their bikes or whatever, right? So we have to I think we have to break through the barriers that we have today and think through those things.
Yeah, I think for sure. And where's that person going to go? Are they going to the market? Are they going to a sports stadium with another 80,000 people? Are they going to work? Are they just going out to the open space so they can go on a hike?
Yeah, exactly.
It kind of depends on, or are they traveling, to a foreign country to go for work or for fun, and just different ways to think about all those things. But they all kind of play a role, which is why I think I go back to, when you're doing this kind of innovative conceptual thinking, as many brains as you can have in there and as many opinions as you can have in there, it's important. Because I used to tell my team, it doesn't matter where the good idea comes from, but just be open-minded that it can come from anywhere.
Yeah.
It could come from somebody who's just wandering by and overhears you, and they're not even part of the team, and maybe they're not even a technologist, but they'll say, "Oh, yeah, I would never use that because of this."
Yeah.
Oh wow, I never thought of that. That's a totally valid point.
Yeah, that's why it's important to sort of get out from the your team and just get out there and experience the world, and then also expose your products to the outside, right? So that you can get feedback immediately and take it from there.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we often get locked in our little bubbles, and it's different kind of work. So we have to just be thoughtful. That's why I think the product management and product development disciplines, they have to be. It's like an organism. It can't be us versus them. It can't be throwing things over the wall. It can't be, I'm done with my piece, now you do your piece, and I'll tell you if it's good enough at the end. I mean, it just has to be collaborative, kind of the whole time. And open-minded, where you're always kind of looking for feedback. You're looking for that constructive feedback and not so defensive of what you're doing. Because it's hard when you've been working on something for a year and somebody goes, well, I wouldn't use that. Well, really? That hurt. As opposed to, tell me why. Tell me why. And I can either tell you that you're thinking about it wrong, or, oh my gosh, that's something we hadn't thought about, or that's even a better idea.
Yeah. So, or maybe that person who said that isn't the right market for what you're trying to sell. There's so many ways to it.
It could be, for sure. Yes. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, this is fantastic. Thanks so much. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Best way is you can find me on LinkedIn, Greg Mcneil, Kurio Labs, and also Greg at KurioLabs.com. And Kurio is spelled with a K, Kurio Labs. And that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. So I'll put your contact information in the show notes if anybody wants to get in touch with you. So this has been great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. Take care.
All right, talk to you soon. Bye.